Our next artist is Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci is probably one of the most famous and recognizable artists of the Italian Renaissance. So we're going to start by talking about Da Vinci and some background information about him. The first thing that we want to note about him is that he is one of the few people that has a unique title in this time. He was what was called a Renaissance man, if you want to put that in quotes, Renaissance man. And then put a little dash after it. And a Renaissance man is a phrase used to describe an individual who has many talents. An individual who has many talents. So this term Renaissance man was a phrase that was kind of coined during this time period, and it was supposed to describe someone that was good at a lot of different types of things. Kind of like a more modern phrase for it would be a jack of all trades. And Da Vinci had many different skills. He was an artist of this time period. He was also an engineer. He did a lot of different drawings of this time period of different kind of apparatuses. Like one of the most interesting was a sketch he did of what he called his flying machine. And the flying machine looks very similar to a mock-up of an early version of a helicopter. And this was in, the 1500s that he was coming up with these ideas, and flight wouldn't even occur for another 400 some years. So he was definitely advanced in his time. So he was an engineer, and then he was also a scientist. He was very curious about the natural world and how science worked, and making lots of observations about things. So we'll talk about that more in a second. So he was what was considered a Renaissance man. Second thing we want to note about him is that he was patronized by the Medicis and many churches in this time period. Patronized by the Medicis and many churches. So he had lots of different patrons of his art, and that also led to kind of a lot of the success of why he's such a recognizable figure in Italian Renaissance art. Third thing that we want to note about Da Vinci is that he was very interested in studying the natural world and using the technique of naturalism. So we'll see that in some of his work. And then the other thing is he was also very interested in capturing human anatomy accurately. Capturing human anatomy, ANATOMY, accurately. So Da Vinci, with a lot of his subjects, was paying careful attention to kind of their physical structure and making sure that his pieces mirrored their images very, very accurately. Some of the interesting things that Da Vinci used to do is he would go out and he would draw and sketch for hours both the environment. He would sit and draw birds and animals and plants and all kinds of different things, so that then when he was painting them, he had a great understanding of what those different things looked like. And then he would do the same thing with human anatomy. There were a lot of interesting stories of how he would go and actually ask for cadavers, which are dead bodies, and he would bring them back to his kind of shop where he would do his work, and he would examine them and sketch them so that way he could get the human form right, and that he would cut them up to look at kind of the muscles and bones and things. So he was very fascinated with those types of things. And I know that sounds strange, but that was how he was able to create such amazing kind of detailed art that we're going to see. So now let's look at some of his pieces. So we'll start with his piece that's called The Virgin of the Rocks. Now in this particular piece, this piece is showing Mary, the Virgin Mary, there in the center. You can see that she's kneeling down. And if you look, her hand off to the left is placed around the figure that is Jesus. And Jesus is kind of knelt down, and you can see his hands are clasped together, very much to look like he is praying. And then across from him is Mary's sister and her son, which is John the Baptist, who is another important figure in biblical stories. And what's interesting, if you look in the background as well as the foreground of this painting, you can see there's a lot of detail to the rocks and plants that are being painted within that surrounding area. And that also within this piece, what's interesting is one of the kind of tricks that Da Vinci used to do, because he cared a lot about kind of the audience perspective and trying to find ways to kind of bring them into the piece so that their eyes were focusing on things. He used a technique that's called a compositional triangle. Compositional triangle. COMPOSITIONAL. Compositional triangle. And if you're looking at the screen at this piece, if you take your hands and take your two pointer fingers and your thumbs and make them into a triangle and then hold them up to the screen, you can see how the top of Mary's head makes kind of the point of the triangle, and then all the other figures are kind of encompassed within your fingers. And that was a technique that he did to try and kind of draw your eye into what was most important within the piece. And it was kind of visually appealing to the audience. So that was kind of an interesting trick that he used. So this piece, the Virgin of the Rocks, is where we have Mary, the baby Jesus, and John the Baptist and his mother all sitting together, surrounded by identifiable plants and rocks. So this is one of Da Vinci's earlier pieces, and as you can see, it fits with the subject matter of the time, which was, stories from the Bible and other kind of religious art. And then that takes us to his next piece, which is very famous, which is called The Last Supper. Now, in this particular piece, it is showing kind of the event of Christ at his last meal prior to his crucifixion. And what is supposed to be happening in this piece is that they're sitting around the table, and all of a sudden Christ says to his disciples that one of you will betray me. And what this does is it basically kind of sparks everyone having some type of reaction. So if you look carefully at the different faces of the disciples, you will see they are all kind of responding differently to this information. If you look to the figure that's fourth from the left, that is supposed to be Judas, and Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus. And you can see in his hand, he is grasping a small gray pouch, and that is supposed to be the money that he was paid for turning Jesus over to the authorities. So there's a lot of detail in this piece with all of the different, foods as well as cups of wine and things that are situated on the table. We also can see how this piece uses the concept of the compositional triangle again, because if you look at the image of Jesus there in the center, Jesus himself is a compositional triangle. And then if you look at the disciples around him, they are all grouped together in groups of 3, which again, we talked about how Da Vinci felt that that number and that imagery was very visually appealing. So he was definitely using a lot of those techniques to try and draw the audience in. So this particular piece kind of highlights those things, as well as using a lot of the vivid colors and careful detail to the individuals that are seated at this table and their reactions. So this piece, The Last Supper, showing Christ saying, "One of you shall betray me," with the disciples around him responding, and Judas, Judas, is grasping money since he was the guilty party. All right, and that takes us to the last piece, which is probably the most famous and valuable piece of art in the entire world, which is the Mona Lisa. And so the Mona Lisa is a really unique piece of this time period. It was a portrait of a woman. And what's unique about her is that she has a hint of a smile. And she also is looking directly out at the audience. And both of those things were very uncommon at the time. Most portraits, as well as the concept of the portrait and the subject matter looking out at the audience, were both uncommon in that time period. So we didn't often see smiling or contact with the eyes from the audience. So that's something that makes this piece very unique. Additionally, what makes this piece very interesting and popular is that a lot of people have questions about this piece. They want to know who the woman in the piece is. Through modern kind of techniques and research, they believe that it was the wife of a wealthy Italian merchant. However, there's still a lot of speculation about who is this, Mona Lisa, who inspired this piece. And so because of it, it has been a really kind of unique item that has been coveted by many throughout the world. For a short period of time in the 1950s, the Mona Lisa was actually stolen by an Italian man. It's housed in the Louvre, which is in Paris. And he walked right into the Louvre and basically took it off the wall, put it in a small briefcase, suitcase kind of satchel, and carried it right out. And no one was the wiser until they realized it was gone. And eventually, after I think a year or so, were able to track him down. He had the Mona Lisa hidden under his bed, of all places. And he went to jail for quite a long time. And from then on, the Mona Lisa, they had to kind of up the security around it. So today, if you were to visit this piece, it's still housed in the Louvre, but it's housed behind bulletproof glass, as well as has a big roped off area, and then it's in a room that's kind of a self-enclosed room, which means that if anything was taken off the wall or disturbed or touched, that big kind of security gates come down and basically lock that person into the room. So it's more or less impossible to steal today, and that's just because it's such a valuable piece of art. So the Mona Lisa, just a kind of quick review, portrait of a woman with a hint of a smile, and she looks directly out at the audience. And both of those things were very uncommon in that time period, which is one of the things that makes it such an interesting and unique piece. So that is Da Vinci and some of his most famous pieces. So now let's take a look at Michelangelo.